Suicide of the West. An essay on the meaning and destiny of liberalism. James Burnham. Chapter 8. Do liberals really believe in liberalism?
The judgments that liberals render on public issues, domestic and foreign, are as predictable as the salivation of Pavlovian dogs. Whether it's a matter of independence for Poggaland or school integration for some southern backwater, the latest loyalty oath or a nuclear test ban, the closed shop or the most recent inquiry of the Committee on Un-American Activities, foreign aid or poll taxes, the United Nations or fair employment, whether it's X, Y, or Z, you can know in advance, with the same comforting assurance with which you expect the sun to rise tomorrow, what the response of the liberal community, give or taken, adverb or two, will be. The editorials in the Washington Post, New York Times, New Republic, or indeed Paris Le Monde or London Sunday Observer, the liberal columns, speeches and sermons, the deliberations of the faculties of any Ivy League university, the discussions of the Foreign Policy Association, League of Women Voters or American Association of University Professors. The small flourishes of special rhetoric in their commentaries are like the minor decorations permitted on a rigorously fixed style of painting, architecture or music. These myriad but manifestly not random judgments were the raw data from which I started in composing this book. I addressed, in effect, the liberal community, saying, "Tell me, please, where I may discover what the underlying principles are that give this marvelous confidence and cohesion to the specific judgments all of you are able to make so spontaneously for the ordering of your lives and the lives of the rest of us. Tell me, so that I too can perhaps learn by deliberate study to share your ability, since I seem not to have been endowed with it by nature." But my request, I found, was not easily fulfilled. I could not locate any book, for example, though my liberal friends have produced thousands upon thousands of books, where I could read the major principles of liberalism exhibited in an orderly manner, save for that one modest and rather superficial little volume by Professor Shapiro, whose name is not elevated enough to count very much on those loftier planes where our opinions are made and remade. There are plenty of books wherein this principle or that, and sometimes 3 or 4 together, are discussed in learned or inspiring prose, and one can sense the organic doctrine hovering like a brood hen over many an historical, political or moral treatise. That is enough, certainly, for liberals themselves, who have the whole system of principles woven into the fabric of their spirits, but it does not answer an alien's need. When, despairing of the printed record, I sought a verbal answer from experienced and literate liberals, I was told, well, modern liberalism believes, fundamentally, in freedom, in the dignity of man, in peace, in welfare. Yes, of course. Undoubtedly we all believe in freedom, peace, welfare and the dignity of man. But alas, that didn't get me very far forward. What is the content of freedom, dignity, peace and welfare in our age? By what programs are they fulfilled, defended and enlarged? With whose help, and against whom? The really troubling questions remain. So I then concluded, since I cannot get an answer from others, I will have to find the answer myself, by carrying through a project of logical exploration, to unearth the set of ideas, principles and beliefs that can explain and motivate the kind of specific opinions that liberals hold and the kind of judgments they render. But when my project began to yield some results that were communicated to others, liberals among them, through lectures, seminars and conversations that were preliminary stages in making this book, this liberal or that would throw up his hands and protest, "Oh no, that's not me you're talking about. That's maybe Condorcet or Fourier or some other romantic fellow from ages past. Or it's those sticky chaps in Americans for Democratic Action, whom I don't have much truck with. Or that's what any sensible person thinks, not just us liberals." I think I can guess why many liberals shy nervously away from the explicit statement of the liberal principles. Part, at least, of what they suddenly see is unfamiliar, and they are not sure they like it. Modern liberalism, for most liberals, is not a consciously understood set of rational beliefs, but a bundle of unexamined prejudices and conjoined sentiments. The basic ideas and beliefs seem more satisfactory when they are not made fully explicit, when they merely lurk rather obscurely in the background, coloring the rhetoric and adding a certain emotive glow. Democracy, equality, popular government, free speech, peace, universal welfare, progress, are symbols that warm the heart, but the mind has a hard time getting through the smoke that surrounds them. Naturally, this is true not only of liberalism but of most ideologies and attitudes. Very few persons bother to inquire into the logical foundations of their day-by-day judgments and rules of conduct, nor is there any reason why many people should. And nearly everyone who does make such an inquiry is likely to be disturbed by what he finds out, that is, he is likely to be rationally dissatisfied with one or more of the principles that logical analysis proves to be the basis for the judgments and evaluations he is in the habit of making. I certainly do not want to end up sticking pins into a straw man. I want my portrait of liberalism to be so undeniable a likeness that liberals themselves, liberals especially, will recognize and accept it, after a little prodding perhaps, no matter how they may feel about whatever interpretative comment goes along with it. But at the same time there is no reason why liberals should be permitted to evade responsibility for their beliefs, and for the logical implications and the practical consequences of those beliefs. Liberals, surely, are logically committed to belief in something, whether they wish to admit it or not, and it must be something noticeably different in many respects from what conservatives, say, or reactionaries or fascists are committed to. So far as the liberal ideology can be stated as a more or less systematic set of ideas and beliefs, I have now stated it, and the result is before us. If liberalism is not what I say it is, then what is it? Let us worry a few pages longer the question, do liberals really believe in liberalism? We may translate more exactly, do those persons who are generally known as liberals and who regard themselves as liberals really believe the 19 propositions on our diagnostic list, or nearly all of them? If we are using the word believe in a psychological sense, in which to believe so and so means to give conscious assent to so and so, we will find that many liberals do believe all 19 propositions, and that all liberals believe most of them. Certainly a man who disbelieved a majority of the 19 would not regard himself, or be regarded, as a liberal. There are some liberals, however, who will say that they disagree with several of the 19 propositions. Most of such psychological non-assent is not significant. The reason for it, as I have already mentioned, is merely that most people don't think in general terms anyway and don't take the time, even if they have the skill, to examine their own ideas with logical precision. Most people, that is to say, quite literally, don't know what they believe. But there are also some sophisticated and even philosophical liberals who dissent quite consciously and rather volubly from a few of the diagnostic 19, and I shall return in a moment to the problem this raises for the attempt to arrive at a satisfactory definition of the liberal ideology. If we are thinking of belief in what might be called a pragmatic rather than a psychological sense, we will find a considerably wider variation in the relation of liberals to liberalism. To believe in liberalism in this pragmatic sense would mean not merely to say you believed in it, but to act in your private and public conduct in accordance with its principles and injunctions. Undoubtedly there are many persons generally regarded as liberals, including some who also regard themselves as liberals, who do not thus believe in liberalism, who do not, for it comes down to this, practice what they preach. Sometimes, as in the case of many politicians who find the liberal label a useful tool of their profession, the discordance comes from a straightforward cynicism. In an era of democracy, Robert Michaels observed several decades ago, all the factors of public life speak and struggle in the name of the people, of the community at large. The government and rebels against the government, kings and party leaders, tyrants by the grace of God and usurpers, rabid idealists and calculating self-seekers, all are the people, and all declare that in their actions they merely fulfill the will of the nation. Even conservatism assumes a democratic form. Before the assaults of the democratic masses it has long since abandoned its primitive aspect. A candidate who should present himself to his electors by declaring to them that he did not regard them as capable of playing an active part in influencing the destinies of the country, and should tell them that for this reason they ought to be deprived of the suffrage, would be a man of incomparable sincerity, but politically insane. Sometimes, as happens within the community of every faith, the deviation from the code springs not from the cynicism of a deliberate rascal but from the weakness of a sincere believer. The best of liberals, even like St. Paul's just man, can fall, if not 7 times daily, at least every now and then, can find himself, perhaps, lying on the delicious white sand of a sunny beach where Negro or Jewish foot ne'er trod, or stuffing a few extra ballots into the box to make quite sure that the will of the people coincides with his personal program for the march toward the good society. But amiable peccadilloes of this sort, that make the whole world kin, will not be charged, by one who thinks ideologically at any rate, to the account of principles. Indeed, it is not infrequently the sinners who are the most passionate in affirming all the articles of the creed. However, my interest here is in neither the psychological or the pragmatic meaning of belief, but what might be termed the logical meaning. Whether or not liberals consciously assent to the beliefs into which I have resolved the liberal ideology, and whether or not their conduct is uniformly in accord with them, these are the beliefs that articulate liberalism into a rational, even if not reasonable, system, that can provide a logical, even if false, explanation for the specific opinions, programs, projects, aims and preferences of liberals. A rather simple mental exercise should help convince us that these beliefs, or beliefs very similar to them, are the ones required to fulfill that logical task. If we assume these 19 beliefs to be valid, then the judgments that liberals pronounce and the proposals they advocate make good sense. Concerning, for example, racial integration in the United States, if the races are indeed equal in civilizing ability, if education and democratic social reform will cure society's ills, if discrimination is socially wrong and government has the universal duty to correct social wrongs, if legitimate government is democratic and democracy rests on the one-man one-vote rule, if tradition and local custom weigh nothing against principle, then, as liberals believe and demand, all forms of racial discrimination should be forbidden, by law and at once. But if the basic liberal beliefs are false or questionable, if even a single one of those just listed is false, then the logical argument for the liberal view on racial integration dissolves. The liberal view may still be correct, but it no longer has any rational frame, it becomes a matter of prejudice, sentiment or faith. Now it may be that the best way to deal with matters of this sort is by sentiment, prejudice and faith, and it may be that in any case a rational frame is only a cover for this non-rational trio, but for liberalism, whose formal appeal must be to reason and science, such admissions are taboo. The liberal therefore cannot cut himself off from the only beliefs that can seem to provide him with a shelter of logic. So, too, concerning liberal judgments about social welfare, academic freedom, decolonization, the United Nations, foreign policy toward right-wing dictators, penology, aid to underdeveloped nations, the liberal can give his conclusions a logical justification only with the help of the principles we have reviewed. If these principles are abandoned, many of the specific liberal opinions and proposals are likely to seem absurd as well as arbitrary. Principles aside, could anything be more absurd, for example, than to expect an Indonesia, a Vietnam, an African ex-colony or Caribbean duchy, to behave like a constitutional republic? This is the most important sense in which liberals really believe in liberalism. Without the 19 propositions, they have no logical legs to stand on. The liberals, whether they like it or not, are stuck with liberalism. An optimistic theory of human nature and history has a major role, perhaps the crucial role, in the liberal ideology. It may be asked, is this theory really a necessary part of liberalism? Even if the liberal forebears of the 18th and 19th century used to believe it, as they undoubtedly did, cannot the late 20th century liberals dispense with it? And is it not a fact that some present-day liberal thinkers have denied it, while holding to the other liberal beliefs more immediately related to political and social affairs? It is true that among the more sophisticated of our liberal thinkers there are some who have denied the optimistic theory of human nature and history, and a good many more, both sophisticated and naive, who forget, overlook or ignore it. This is not surprising. Once the optimistic theory has been separated out from the bundle, made explicit and placed in the dock for judgment, men acquainted with modern science, art and literature cannot defend it openly without risking conviction for intellectual obsolescence. I have already mentioned Max Lerner as a liberal whose hankering after Freud has inclined him toward heresy in his ideas about man. Sidney Hook, who has always had some trouble preventing facts from interfering with his ideology, has followed John Dewey in seeking the help of dialectical formulas that synthesize the classic dogma, man is evil, with the Enlightenment dogma, man is good, into an account that is sufficiently qualified in every direction to cover every contingency. Professor Charles Frankel, in the case for modern, i.e., liberal, man, announces that it is his purpose in this book
to re-examine the credentials of liberal philosophy, and to do so by considering the most representative and influential indictments which have been drawn up against it.
And in the event he shows that he has a formal or cocktail party acquaintance with many of the facts and arguments that can be introduced as evidence in the case against modern liberalism. But there was never any need for the defendant to fear the outcome of the trial. Professor Frankel's judgment had been firmly decided before court opened, as he quite frankly admits in his introductory pages.
This book is a defense of the revolution of modernity,
a term he equates with liberalism.
It is an attempt to show that these doom-filled prophecies
of the critics of liberalism
are unwarranted, and that the hopes with which the modern era began are still the hopes by which we may steer our course. I believe that these liberal ideas, notwithstanding all the criticisms that are being made of them, are essentially right in their logic, right in their estimate of what is possible, and right in their estimate of what is desirable.
The Pledge of Allegiance is gallant and unqualified, and any difficulties that remain after the justs with the critics Professor Frankel dissolves by denuding the theory of all factual reference that anyone could put a finger on. But it is Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr. who has made the boldest gambit. In Chapter 3 of The Vital Center, Mr. Schlesinger substitutes the terms progressive and progressivism for liberal and liberalism. He attributes to progressivism an extreme and somewhat caricaturized version of many elements of the liberal ideology, in particular the doctrines of progress and human perfectibility. He then renounces progressivism so defined, in the name of what he calls radical democracy. Since Mr. Schlesinger is intellectually stylish, his own comments on human nature, anno 1948, when this manifesto of the coming new frontier was mostly written, are sprinkled with references to Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, Proust and other writers whose opinions on human nature and conduct are far from flattering. But the denials are like Peter's. An optimistic theory of human nature and history is integral to, logically inseparable from, the whole body of liberal doctrine. When they come out of their theoretical detours and get down to their own ideas and programs, Professor Frankel's Modernity, Professor Hook's Democratic Socialism, Mr. Schlesinger's Radical Democracy, and Mr. Lerner's Radicalism, or whatever he calls it, turn out to be polished-up versions of the standard liberal design, just as does Mr. Hutchins' scholastic-flavored democratism. The payoff invariably comes in the exhortations of the concluding paragraphs. In, for typical example, the Vital Center's rousing farewell chapter, Freedom, a Fighting Faith, the orthodox rhetoric, for all the qualifications, proves irresistible.
Freedom must become, in Holmes' phrase, a fighting faith. The thrust of the democratic faith is toward compromise, persuasion, and consent in politics. In place of theology and ritual, of hierarchy and demonology, it sets up a belief in intellectual freedom and unrestricted inquiry. Man is instinctively anti-totalitarian.
Yes, instinctively. We need not abandon our optimism, only recognize that.
Optimism about man is not enough. The historic methods of a free society are correct so far as they go, but they concentrate on the individual, they do not go far enough. An adequate philosophy of free society would have to supplement the historic tests by such questions as this: do the people have a relative security against the ravages of hunger, sickness, and want? It has become the duty of free society to answer these questions, and to answer them affirmatively if it would survive. The rise of the social welfare state is an expression of that sense of duty. The reform of institutions becomes an indispensable part of the enterprise of democracy. But the reform of institutions can never be a substitute for the reform of man.
We may note in each case how Mr. Schlesinger's words merely reformulate the substance of one or more of the 19 elements of the liberal syndrome. In those last two quoted sentences there reappears unchanged the orthodox doctrine: the only obstacles to the good society are ignorance and bad institutions, both obstacles can be removed with the help of a fighting faith in radical democracy, that is, in liberalism. Wherein lies the hope? Mr. Schlesinger asks and answers in Walt Whitman's words, in The Exercise of Democracy, now raised to a capital letter. The millennium, Mr. Schlesinger goes so far as to grant, may not be fully realized, since democracy, following John Dewey, is a process, not a conclusion. But to the question that he asks in his penultimate paragraph, can we win the fight? It is not quite clear what the fight is for, the process, it would seem, strictly speaking, but it is also against communism and fascism, against oppression and stagnation, against pride and corruption, and for restoring the balance between individual and community. To the question whether we can win, Mr. Schlesinger leaves us in no doubt that we can if we commit ourselves with all our vigor and believe in attack. And out of attack will come passionate intensity. Men as bright as Messrs. Schlesinger, Hooke, Frankel, Lerner and Hutchins know very well that the optimistic theory of man and society is a grave weakness in liberalism's doctrinal equipment, and that is why they try to shake it off, why they avoid its company, and protest when they meet it face to face that it is no friend of theirs. But if man's nature is not plastic and ever subject to beneficent change, not perfectible in large if not quite infinite degree, ready to blossom when the winter cover of ignorance is lifted, then what happens to the liberal confidence in universal education and universal democracy, with full freedom of speech and opinion, of course, as the necessary and sufficient key to progress, to peace, justice and well-being? What if some men, and some tendencies within all men, prefer lies to truth, suffering, including self-suffering, to pleasure and happiness, crime to honest work, fighting to cooperation? What if they use free speech for deceiving instead of educating, and the free ballot as a device for consolidating despotic power instead of fulfilling the will of the people? What then happens to Mr. Hutchins' universal dialogue, to the gallant hopes that Walt Whitman and Mr. Schlesinger stake on the exercise of democracy? What if the government that truly embodies the democratic will of the people turns out to be a hideous tyranny, and not the free, scientific and open society of John Dewey's turgid prose? What if his progressively reared children, unhampered by superstition, custom and traditional disciplines but left free to develop their own free natures, turn out to be not liberals but monsters, turn out to be, let us say, the delinquent monsters that today roam the cement jungles of our great cities? No, we must repeat, if human nature is scored by innate defects, if the optimistic account of man is unjustified, then is all the liberal faith vain. In the end, Professor Frankel suddenly admits, throwing in the sponge.
To believe in the goodness of man is not to commit oneself to any particular description of human behavior. It is not to say that men's good deeds outnumber their evil deeds, or that benevolence is a stronger disposition in men than malice. It is, quite simply, to adopt a policy, the policy of looking for cures for human ailments, and of refusing to take no for an answer.
That is to say, the meaning of the liberal belief about human nature, like that of the liberal beliefs about progress and history, about education, reform and equality, and indeed like the meaning of the beliefs comprising any and all ideologies, is not solely and not primarily a matter of truth and falsity. It is exceedingly naive to suppose that we have solved the problem of an ideological belief, or even understood it, by proving it true or false.
Derivations.
Wrote Vilfredo Pareto, using that term in the sense I am giving to ideologies.
Comprise logical, i.e., scientific and true, reasonings, unsound reasonings, and manifestations of sentiments used for the purpose of derivation. They are manifestations of the human being's hunger for thinking. If that hunger were satisfied by logico-experimental, i.e., scientific, reasonings only, there would be no derivations. Instead of them we should get logico-experimental, scientific, theories. But the human hunger for thinking is satisfied in any number of ways, by pseudo-experimental reasonings, by words that stir the sentiments, by fatuous, inconclusive talk. So derivations come into being.
The various liberal beliefs that we have reviewed, each of them a rather complex affair, do contain or entail cognitive assertions that are either true or false, in nearly every case, as a matter of fact, false. But the matter does not end there. In spite of liberalism's assumption to the contrary, a doctrine's objective claim to truth, especially about moral, political, and social issues, is the least of the motives that lead men to believe in it, nor will an objective proof that the doctrine is false have much influence in leading anyone to abandon it. Moreover, it does not automatically follow that if a doctrine is false, it is therefore bad. Even though the doctrine is false, its consequences in practice, for individual conduct or for society, may still be superior to those from any available alternative. The doctrines of the liberal ideology, then, besides making certain assertions that may be judged true or false, also express attitudes, values, ideals, and goals. Some of these are palpable on the surface. Any reader can intuit the sentiments expressed in Mr. Schlesinger's more excited passages, such as some of those I have quoted, and others are hidden more or less deep under the verbal wrappings. Now we cannot prove attitudes, values, ideals and goals to be false or true in the same sense that we can prove cognitive assertions to be true or false. We can merely try to understand them clearly, to estimate their probable consequences, to relate them to the pattern of human life as we have become acquainted with it, and then to judge them, if we feel called on to judge, as acceptable or unacceptable. A man's goal might be to stay drunk all his waking hours. We can't exactly prove this false by logic and scientific evidence. What we can do is to trace out its probable results, and show what these mean in terms of health, family, friends, job and so on. This is enough to convince some people that the goal of perpetual drunkenness is unacceptable. There are others, however, who like their liquor enough not to care about the meaning and consequence of a drunken life, or who are incapable of staying sober. The philosopher Morris Cohen told the story of a patient with incipient Bright's disease for whom the doctor prescribed a quart of buttermilk daily. After trying the remedy a few weeks, the patient reported back, "Doctor, I'd rather have Bright's disease." In judging the sentiments, values and attitudes associated with a given ideology, there are two special difficulties. Are there, in the first place, any objective criteria that can be applied so that an analysis will have some chance of reaching an agreed conclusion? Anybody who knows the tricks can find out fairly easily whether the logical structure of a doctrine is consistent or not. The question of factual truth is more complicated, but there are fairly well understood rules of evidence that usually can lead to an objectively probable result, if we are willing to consider the evidence objectively, which, of course, we are usually not where morality and politics are concerned. In the case of sentiments, values and attitudes, we can refine and clarify our judgment by observation, study, research, analysis and meditation, but in the end, I suppose, we must either accept or reject. If some ultimate clash of temperament, interest or ideal is at stake, however concealed, then we are not going to get agreement. There will just have to be disagreement, and if the disagreement is of a kind that necessarily leads to practical conflict, then one side will have to prevail. The second difficulty is related to the first. I too, whoever I happen to be, express sentiments, values and interests in all my words, except perhaps when I use mathematical symbols, and maybe then, whether or not my words are also making cognitive assertions that are true or false. So when I write about the sentiments of others, of liberals, say, I cannot avoid expressing my feelings about their feelings. Suppose X says,
The late Eleanor Roosevelt was unfailingly thoughtful and generous in her attitude toward others, particularly toward the neglected and unfortunate.
And suppose Y says,
The late Eleanor Roosevelt was always sticking her nose into other people's affairs.
It is quite possible, I think we all might agree, that those two sentences are identical in cognitive meaning, that, interpreted solely in the cognitive or propositional dimension, they are equivalent and, as a matter of fact, true. And yet there does seem to be a world of difference between them. Perhaps we need to state both in order to understand Mrs. Roosevelt. Aristotle remarked with his usual good sense that it is foolish to expect greater accuracy in our knowledge of a given subject matter than the nature of the subject matter permits. In turning from the examination of liberalism as a set of doctrines to a sketch of liberalism as a cluster of sentiments, attitudes and interests and as a mode of conduct governed by certain typical values or goals, the microscope of logical analysis will be less useful, for the most part, than the everyday observation and experience open to common sense. Our account will have to be more flexible, somewhat impressionistic here and there, and at times a little arbitrary in omitting qualifications and exceptions that could be discovered by minute-enough inquiry. But it can be accurate enough for my purpose, which is not to portray every last detail of every individual liberal's liberalism, but to determine the meaning of modern liberalism as an historical tendency, and the function that it fulfills in our epoch.